Thank you very much for joining us today for this Military Balance 2020 press launch, and joining me to answer your questions after my formal remarks are Professor François Heisbourg, Dr. Bastian Giegerich, Meia, Nouwens, and Douglas Barrie, and we have a number of IISS experts also in the front row here who can assist. As this edition of the Military Balance is published, advanced military capabilities augmented by potentially disruptive new technologies continue to spread. Key elements of the rules-based international order that characterize the post-Second World War period are being challenged. The demise of the INF Treaty exemplifies this most clearly. Its collapse was precipitated by Russia's alleged breaches, as well as the Trump administration's assessment, with an eye to China's military modernization, that the bilateral accord had outlived its usefulness. The next few months will be crucial in determining whether New START, the remaining pillar of the bilateral post-Cold War arms control architecture, will be extended. One criticism of New START is that, like the INF, it excludes China. Another is that it does not cover certain new technology developments. However, the treaty provides insights into capabilities through its verification regime that otherwise would have to be addressed by other surveillance capacities. Conflict in Ukraine's east still simmers. North Korea has begun testing missiles again, and terrorists continue to challenge security forces globally. Conflict and instability persist in Africa and the Middle East, including in Libya and Yemen. The US decision to withdraw military personnel from northern Syria and a Turkish incursion targeting Kurdish forces brought the unexpected sight of Russian and Turkish troops engaged in joint patrols. The US killing of Qasem Soleimani in January, meanwhile, reminded regional states of the potency of the US armed forces, but also underscored the requirement for military power to be combined with a clear strategy. On defense spending, our figures show that aggregate global defense spending in 2019 rose by 4% compared to 2018 when measured in constant 2015 dollars. This was the largest increase observed in 10 years. Spending rose as economies recovered from the effects of the financial crisis, but increases have also been driven by sharpening threat perceptions. In Europe, worries about Russia continue to prompt spending increases. Overall, Europe's defense spending in 2019 rose by 4.2% when compared with 2018. However, this increase only brought total European defense spending back to the levels observed when the financial crisis began in 2008, when measured in real terms. The world's principal defense spenders are spending yet more. The nominal increase in US defense spending at US $53.4 billion came close to equaling the UK's entire 2019 defense budget of US $54.8 billion. This nominal US increase would, if measured on its own, constitute the seventh largest defense budget in the world. Defense spending growth in 2019 by both China and the US outstripped the global average. Each country spent 6.6% more than in 2018. However, the trajectory of their spending is diverging. The budget increase in the US was the greatest in 10 years. But in a reflection of economic conditions, the pace has been slowing in China. Both countries continue to devote significant sums to research, development, and procurement, as does Russia. Moscow is moving ahead with the development of faster and innovative weapons. Tests continue on the Poseidon nuclear-armed long-range autonomous underwater vehicle. Progress, though halting, is also being made with the Burevestnik nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed cruise missile. The Avant-Garde hypersonic glide vehicle is entering service. The Kinjal air-launched ballistic missile has been observed on MiG-31K aircraft, while Moscow has spoken of further integrating precision weapons on naval vessels. In recent years, the IISS has noted the spread of land attack cruise missiles across Russia's fleet. Moscow is now discussing fitting to its naval vessels the 3M-22 Zircon high-speed anti-ship cruise missile, which, assuming developments proceed smoothly, will further concern Western navies. Russia's pursuit of these capabilities reflects its continuing military modernization process. Moscow is looking to improve the firepower and rapid reaction capacities of its armed forces and is still testing its weapons and troops in Syria. Nonetheless, it's worth remembering that some of this emerging equipment has a Soviet-era design heritage. Moreover, budget reductions and industrial limitations continue to hinder Russia's procurements. There were headlines when in May 2019, Moscow increased its order of fifth-generation Su-57 Felon multi-role fighters from 16 to 76. But earlier in the program, Moscow had envisaged buying around 200 Su-57s by 2025. Indeed, the 2019 increase in Su-57 numbers was enabled, Moscow said, by industrial efficiencies, not by more funding. The precise capability of this aircraft is also uncertain. The engine that was originally intended for the Su-57 is still not ready. Meanwhile, the main battle tank derived from the Armata Universal Combat Platform has yet to enter service, and shipbuilding, particularly for surface platforms, remains glacial. Concerns over China's military modernization still loom largest for the US and are driving equipment and procurement decisions in Washington and some of its partners. Beijing acknowledged in its 2019 white paper that its plans were delayed in some areas, but its military modernization remains striking for its scale, speed, and ambition. In 2019, China stood up the first operational unit with its Chengdu J-20A combat aircraft and has maintained recent progress in developing and fielding new air-launched missiles. China is also pursuing an advanced bomber to replace its aging H-6s. Like Russia and the US, China's bomber will likely be a low observable flying wing design. Beijing's October 2019 military parade, marking the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic, showcased systems designed to achieve military effect faster and at greater range than before. China, too, is pushing ahead with hypersonic systems and displayed its DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle at the parade. China and Russia's hypersonic developments will, if their glide vehicles can effectively maneuver, challenge missile defenses. But developing this capability is not easy, and defending against hypersonic systems is not impossible. China's Navy continues to grow, supported by a shipbuilding sector that maintains its prodigious pace of production. The PLA Navy has one advanced type O-55 cruiser in service and 7 more in various stages of construction, as well as an inventory of 30 destroyers, 52 frigates, and 48 corvettes. In the Asia-Pacific, if one discounts US forces in the region, Taiwan currently has the most cruisers, though these are aging, and Japan the most destroyers. But China is rapidly catching up. Moreover, the composition of its fleet has significantly changed in recent years to incorporate more modern designs. In service or in the pipeline, China has at least 23 of its modern Type O-52D destroyers and at least 100 of its latest frigate and corvette designs. It is true that hull numbers are only part of the story. Effective capability depends on factors including the quality and integration of weapons and sensors, and training and logistics, but here too, China is improving. Moving to NATO and Europe, great power competition continues to dominate long-term Western defense policymaking and procurement, but there is now less apparent coherence than before in terms of political responses. National impulses are increasingly prominent. 1 month before the December 2019 NATO summit in London, President Macron claimed that the alliance was brain dead and seemed to cast doubt on the Article 5 commitment to collective defense. For his part, President Trump offered little in the way of reassurance. 2 out of the alliance's 3 nuclear powers, the other one being the UK, have now introduced a degree of uncertainty on the key issue of the collective defense clause. Within NATO and beyond, the arrival of additional US personnel and equipment is not necessarily sufficient anymore to dispel allies and partners' concerns over US strategy, commitment, and engagement, or wholly deter opponents. The US continues to deploy personnel to Eastern Europe in support of NATO commitments, and during 2019 increased its deployments to the Gulf in response to Iranian activity. However, these did not effectively constrain Tehran. Forces like those sent to the Middle East may have widened US military options, but they also emphasize the difficulty Washington faces in sustaining its focus on the Asia-Pacific. Moreover, Washington might not always be able in the future to supply the forces or capabilities needed by allies and partners. If a crisis required US forces to surge to the Asia-Pacific, Washington might look to move enabling assets such as C4ISR or tanker or transport aircraft from Europe or the Middle East. Or the US could prioritize its own needs in a way that limited allies' own operational capacity. The technological edge long held by the US and its allies continues to erode. Cyber and space capabilities are being further integrated into warfighting planning, and the range of civil sector technologies with military utility will only increase further. At the same time, traditional military materiel, such as rocket artillery and air defense systems, are of renewed relevance, while advanced conventional military capabilities, such as the land attack cruise missiles, shown on our splendid latest wall chart, continue to spread. Responses may include agile defense structures and equipment, more funding, more internal and multinational coordination, and improved integration of civil sector technologies. However, the West may fail. Funding may be increasing in Western states, but in most it is not rising on a scale that would permit capability gaps to be fully filled anytime soon. And Western states face a personnel problem too. The 2018 protests from Google employees about work on the Project Maven military AI contract highlights challenges in integrating emerging technologies. Whether these are felt to the same degree in China and Russia is probably open to question. Conflict will in the future still involve hard military power and conventional as well as unconventional capabilities. It will be more infused with emerging technologies. However, the deployment of traditional military power is not in every case an effective counter to the astute deployment of informal force by adversaries willing to operate below the threshold of war. Examples include Russia's strategy in Ukraine, its use of chemical agents in the UK, and its election meddling. Iran's ability to conduct warfare through third parties gave Tehran a strategic advantage over adversaries reliant on conventional capabilities, according to our recent strategic dossier on Iran's networks of influence. Conflict is now more diffused than before. It involves more actors and more capabilities. The resilience of societies and civilian infrastructure will be a necessary future focus. Engagements involving military and security forces will be more persistent than before, and clear outcomes in peace, war, and the gray zone between will be, we judge, elusive. And so with that, I invite your questions to the panel on the stage and to our experts in the front row. Anyone who wishes to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we'll make certain the microphone comes to you at pace. Yes. From an excellent German blogger.
Thank you very much. Thomas Wiegold, I'm writing a blog on defense affairs in German. When I see all these lists about new ships and new capabilities, I'm wondering what is usually called cyber capabilities are getting more importance. However, still big steel, big ammo is still the way to go. Is this a conclusion you can draw from what you have just said?
Let me make a prefatory comment before handing over to Bastian Giegerich and then François Heisbourg. But on cyber, you rightly said that the IISS for now 59, 60 years has been accounting for land, air, sea, space assets. And we realize the requirement to be able to account more effectively for military-owned cyber power. But for that, one needs to develop a proper methodology for assessing military-owned cyber power. And the IISS has been working in the last 2 years with experts from the SIGINT communities and from industry to establish that methodology. And we hope in upcoming years to be able to add an assessment of a nation's cyber power into our military balance work. We've already made detailed assessments of about 15 countries' cyber power, a net assessment of, as it were, and we want to be in a position, if not to rank countries, 1 to 40, to be able to understand what does it take for a tier 3 cyber power to move into tier 2, and what would it take for a tier 2 power to move into tier 1. So it's an area that the IISS wants to establish the gold standard in, and that's what Bastian Giegerich's team is engaged in. So Bastian, over to you, and then to François.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we can also get James in on this question, James Hacker, the editor of the Military Balance. Thomas Wiegold, I think the answer to your question is we are at this point in a situation where clearly both matters, and the traditional steel, metal things are still very important. There's a psychological element to deterrence, which suggests it works a bit better if you can see it, and those things matter, and not just for psychological reasons, but obviously very much so for operational reasons. The point, however, is of course that we are rapidly moving into a situation where the digital and cyber-enabled backbone of those forces, even if they might be using something that is made of steel, will continue to grow in importance, to change the way command and control works, to change the way ISR capabilities work and different sensors work. So I think we're on that journey, but I don't think we are yet at a point where one can discard the sheer impact of these capabilities that we have known for so long, and that we need to continue to look at. However, we are moving into, as a team, into a situation where we develop detailed methodologies to make detailed assessments that are comparative internationally. That will remain our goal in this area as well. In the back of the book, and I'll invite James Hackett in a minute to maybe say a word on this, we're beginning to explain our emerging thinking on this, and then we'll integrate it as a data set as we go along.
François.
Yeah, what I would simply add is the following. We have, as it were, 3 points of the triangle. One part of the triangle is the steel, and the steel remains important because you can't actually destroy stuff without going kinetic, and you need platforms to take on board the kinetic stuff. So that remains true. Secondly, we have the revolution, and it's a fairly new angle. It's the angle of accuracy. You have this map, I don't know whether we've been able to display it or not, of land attack cruise missiles. Why are more than 20 countries investing into highly capable land attack cruise missiles? Why didn't they do so before? Because after all, the first land attack cruise missile was invented here in this country, not very far away from this city. It was called the V1. And yet, for the following 50 years, the cruise missiles were either nuclear, like the Soviet Union and the States, or they simply did not really exist. They are now the backbone of a number of military establishments because they are accompanied by accuracy. And this sort of chart, I promise you that in 3 or 4 years, there will be a similar chart for the proliferation of accurate ballistic missiles. Look at our friends in Iran. Accuracy to attack with drones and cruise missiles the oil installations of Aramco, each vehicle individually targeted. and each vehicle, to the extent that its engine actually brought it to the target, hitting exactly the target allocated. Ditto a few months later with ballistic missiles when the Iranians shot at that American-Iraqi base near Baghdad. Ballistic missiles with a circular error probable of around 5 meters. This is a real revolution. And then the third angle, and it's one to which John has been alluding to in his presentation, and that is, in order to give military and strategic value to the two angles I just mentioned, you need to bring new organizational skills to military establishments. Agility. Russia has become an agile military power. This is something which had never happened in its history. It has become like Britain or France in that respect. The capability to plan and to choreograph intricate operations required by individually accurately targeted vehicles. That's what the Iranians have achieved in the Middle East. There are now two powers who have that capability in the Middle East. One is Israel, and the other is Iran. That's a really big change. And these are the sorts of elements of evaluation which we try to factor into the military balance in a more or less systematic manner as they emerge. And when they have emerged in a big way, you get this. Voilà.
James Hackett, a word on cyber, and then we'll go back.
Thanks, John. Just a quick word on AI and things like that. When we heard in the town hall earlier on today, the word killer robots mentioned in terms of AI, but perhaps you might see as many results in terms of logistic support and backroom enabling in the near term as we will kinetic capability derivations from that. On the use of hard power, I think if you look at the military balance Russia and Eurasia chapter this year and the data contained within it, it tracks things like the replacement of Tochka-U, battlefield rockets with longer range Iskander systems, longer and more accurate Iskander systems, the shift to more air mobile forces and the expansion of the VDV, improvements to find, fix and strike artillery complexes, the integration of uninhabited aerial vehicles in that system. And of course, we've seen over the last few years the continuing importance to Russia at a time when people keep talking about information and influence operations and such like, the continuing importance of hard military power as seen through the yearly exercises such as Kavkaz, Center, Vostok and Zapad that we'll see another iteration of this year. On cyber, I think John neatly summed up what we've got in the book this year. The military balance itself is going to look at military-owned cyber capabilities. That, of course, then leaves the wider picture of national capabilities that in some ways enables armed forces actions out of the picture. What we're looking at the moment is capturing information on indicators for the military balance, and that can be things like command and control, personnel, the national strategy documents that underpin cyber policy developments. Those are things you can count. The challenge we then face is assigning to that, and this is a challenge we're now examining in conjunction with the team based in Singapore, assigning to that levels of maturity, and then within that, being able to count how states progress up the ladder and also how states lose their relative capability as, for instance, they become more enmeshed in network-capable warfare that at the same time enhances their vulnerability as much as it does their capability.
James, thank you. Philip Stevens, Financial Times.
Excuse me if I ask a parochial question? I just wonder, given that there's going to be a defence strategic review in the UK, whether there's anyone on the panel who can say, is it going to be possible for Britain to sustain the sort of capabilities it now has and fund its aircraft carriers and the renewal of Trident? And in that context, is there any real scope for bilateral serious cooperation between Britain and France in the next few years?
Perfect. So we'll go in this order. Doug Barrie, Ben Barrie, and then François Heisbourg. Doug?
Thanks, John. It's a very interesting question. I mean, we're all looking to see what happens in terms of how the UK behaves. I think there's obviously a mismatch between global Britain, the ambition, and the military capability to support that. in terms of the review process itself, I think there remains a question as to whether this is going to be a fundamental root and branch review, or it may be pared down somewhat. There are some interesting misalignments, if you like, in terms of some of the issues that surround this. In terms of the bilateral relationship with France, I think there is still room for further work. I mean, the Lancaster House Agreement is still extant. There are some nuclear aspects of that which remain important. Obviously, the UCAV didn't come to fruition, and the UAV work also fell apart. I think at the uniform level, the relationship seems to work pretty well between the two countries' armed forces.
Ben?
The UK has got a massive shortfall between its ambition to buy new equipment and the money available for that. The MOD itself assesses that at 7 billion. The National Audit Office is less optimistic. And that's a key circle that's got to be squared in this forthcoming review. The other thing the Ministry of Defence, and I suspect other parts of the British security establishment, are keen to get is guidance on what the slogan Global Britain actually means. There's been very little forthcoming. But the military balance shows that although the UK considers itself a medium power, in global terms, its armed forces are very small. For example, it's got a single mechanised division. Both France and Germany can field two. I think it's genuinely enthusiastic about ever-increasing military cooperation with France. It's also cooperating a lot with the Northern Group countries. Whether it could do more, for example, with Germany, I think is an open question. It's very instructive that a small European country, the Netherlands, has effectively embedded most of its army in German formations to mutual benefit.
François Heisbourg.
Yeah, 3 points. The first one is a procedural point, but it's actually also a fundamental one. And that is, I understand that this review is supposed to be an integrated review, that it is supposed to take into account the defense assets, the diplomatic assets, the development assets, and so on. This is a laudable design, but it's also one which is very difficult to do. When I mean to do, is to do with effect, because I assume that the purpose of such a review is to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of the security system of the United Kingdom. And in order for that to happen, the people whom you're trying to integrate have to buy into the integration process. I was part of the French white paper 12 years ago, where we did an integration slightly less ambitious than that of which the UK is planning. That is, we wanted to integrate defense assets and homeland defense assets. We managed to pull it off, but it took 11 months, and it was very hard work, and I would have liked to have had 3 more months to actually do the job reasonably well. And here, these guys apparently want to do this within 4 months. This strikes me as a little bit possibly overambitious. I was going to use a nastier word. Second point, the French-British bilateral, I don't have any problem. I don't see any. I agree with what you said, both in terms of mill to mill, or indeed of government to government. We pretty much agree on how things should be done in the various theaters in which we operate together, like in the Sahel. But the third point, and this is the one which really disturbs me, is that, to my understanding, there still hasn't been negotiated a satisfactory status for the United Kingdom vis-à-vis the forthcoming European Defence Fund, which is in the process of the monies for which should be allocated within the next weeks to months, but no more than that. And Britain, for the time being, is sort of outside of the picture. Now, why is this important? It's not simply because Britain and British defence firms wouldn't have ready access to that money as EU firms, but simply because, how do you manage this if you have cross-channel value chains as you do within MBDA, Airbus, Thales, to some extent BAE Systems, and so on. This to me is deeply worrying, particularly if we're going to have only a minimalist free trade deal at the end of the year between the EU and the UK, which seems to be highly probable unless one considers the other alternative, which is no deal. But in both cases, this is going to come back to bite the ability of the French and the British to work together as much as they would want to work together at a defense industrial level. And I say this as somebody who claims some industrial expertise, since I used to work for one of the firms which put together MBDA, the Anglo-French or Franco-English, I'm not sure even how to call it now, companies which is the European missile house, the competitor to Raytheon. So I'm worried on that score. I'm worried on by the ricochet of the EU-UK, the mishandling of the negotiations between the UK and the EU.
Yes. Right, no, right here. No. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Damien McElroy from the National. You talk about different trajectories. I was just wondering, in the Middle East, are you basically saying missiles are becoming where it's at in terms of what we have to look out for?
Yes. Bastian, do you want to take that? I mean, on the centrality of missiles in the force structures of Middle East powers. I mean, I should make a preface that, and I just need to re-advertise again our strategic dossier on Iran's networks of influence in the Middle East, because, of course, the key conclusion of that dossier was that Iran's influence networks constitute a strategic sovereign capability that it judges to be of greater importance to it than its nuclear weapons program or its ballistic missile program, because it is those influence networks and the machine that was built by Qasem Soleimani that most materially changes the effective balance of power in the Middle East on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. So it is true that Iran is obviously, as we've demonstrated, interested in ballistic missile capability, and Gulf states are rightly concerned by their ranges and CEPs. But for an Iranian strategist, it is the machine that Qasem Soleimani built that certainly survives his death that they would be most interested in maintaining. Bastian.
John, thank you. And to put your question in a slightly wider context, I think what we would say is that this is, in a way, the age of the missile, yes. This is a proliferating, developing a capability where technological progress is significant, and it is something that is spreading, as we are showing on the wall chart that deals specifically with land attack cruise missiles. So we have set up a project to look specifically at these questions of evolving missile technology and the regional proliferation trends that draw on this. And maybe Douglas, do you want to say a few words on missile capability in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'd just simply add, I think the attacks on the Aramco sites, particularly the use of the cruise missile, I think was very, very illuminating. Obviously, the Houthi Ansar Allah claimed it, but the fingerprints of Iran were all over it. It's a comparatively small weapon, comparatively simple, but extraordinarily effective. And it seems to have come from a second strand of Iranian cruise missile development. They acquired some missiles illicitly in the early 2000s from Ukraine. They've struggled to reverse engineer those as far as we can tell effectively, particularly the propulsion unit. The system that was used in the Saudi attacks looks to be a much simpler system, possibly with a pretty basic guidance package, but nonetheless very, very effective, and in terms of propaganda effect, massively effective.
François?
Yeah, just what strikes me when I look over time, over the last 10 years in this particular area, is that we see this progress qualitatively and in terms of proliferation. Qualitatively is indeed the move towards accuracy both of cruise missiles and of ballistic missiles. And with this qualitative race going further, we see the Iranians apparently, the visual evidence is for the time being still fairly rare. We see the Iranians testing maneuverable warheads. Now, 30 or 40 years ago, maneuverable warheads were for nuclear ballistic missiles with strategic range, MIRVs, the MIRVing of missiles. Today we are in a universe, and this is the other thing, it's the proliferation of these missiles. The missile is the delivery system comes before what it delivers, if I can put it that way. When the folks were building the atomic weapons for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were thinking about the weapon more than about the delivery system. And they found a delivery system. And this has been the case for many nuclear powers. But now one tends to go first for the delivery system, and then one explores the various options to which one can apply these systems. This is also something which comes across very clearly in the chart. So when you see 23 countries with these kinds of delivery vehicles, and you compare them to the 9 or so countries which have or are deemed to have a nuclear capability, you see that the proliferation of the delivery systems is going on more quickly than that of potential weapons of mass destruction.
I can almost feel one wit in the audience saying, so we're moving to the Amazon world where people build a delivery system first and then figure out how many different types of packages they can provide through it. But one wit in the back, Shashank Joshi from The Economist.
Thanks very much. Could I ask about what your report shows about the mix of manned and unmanned systems, whether there's any trends you can detect? Are we seeing armed forces shift to a higher proportion of unmanned systems in their inventories? Which countries are moving most rapidly on this? Are there pockets where it's particularly pronounced? And then connected to that, but sort of distinct, which armed forces are developing or fielding systems with autonomy at the greatest pace, in your view?
Doug, can you take a first crack?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Perhaps counterintuitively, I think that in some ways, certainly at the high end of uninhabited systems, the uptake has been slower than perhaps you might have expected. If you go back to the start of this century, the expectation in some camps was you would see UCAVs fielded by a range of air powers by this point. That's actually not happened. And in part, I think it goes to your second point about autonomy, in that area, I think we've also bumped into some technological and societal problems, and that society struggles with the idea of killer robots. Now, the name is wrong. As a moniker, it's misleading, but nonetheless, it's out there. In terms of who's actually pushing ahead in uninhabited, I think you only need to look at the Chinese infantry, and in terms of what we're seeing, particularly ISR systems, very large, very capable, that are going to enter the inventory in ever-increasing numbers. And also, they also are pursuing uninhabited combat air vehicles. And that's not to say nobody else is. I mean, you see the Russians with a Hotnik. The US still has interest in it and is working possibly quite a lot in the classified world. And there are European programs as well.
Ben, do you want to say something more? And then, Nick, if you have anything from the naval domain in particular.
The wars of 9/11, Iraq and Afghanistan, drove a massive increase in robotic, remotely operated systems in the land environment, principally for counter-IED, and much of that inheritance remains. I've tracked very active programs of work on further robotic and autonomous ground vehicles, particularly in the US, Russia, but a lot of work going on in UK, France, and Germany, for example. And there's a lot of talk of manned-unmanned teaming. For example, the future French and US tank programs are actively looking at robotic smaller tanks as battle partners. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of work of the application of commercial driverless vehicle technology to assist with logistic vehicles and logistic convoys. One thing we have assessed is that applying artificial intelligence technology, that is machine learning technology, to land fighting systems and indeed to other systems does carry with it a big problem of assurance, because the difference about machine learning software is it rewrites itself. So you don't necessarily get a linear relationship between putting in an input and getting an output. And that's going to be a real challenge for militaries and for industries to explore in the future.
Nick Charles.
Thanks. Just to add on the maritime spectrum, I think this is a domain in which, to some extent, the maritime has been behind the curve in terms, particularly of unmanned systems. The focus has tended to be thinking about drones in an aviation perspective. But I think this is rapidly changing for a number of reasons. First of all, we see some significant developments in terms of both Russia and China in terms of their developments and research into unmanned systems. There is the potential, as we've mentioned in the statement, and it's also in the book, of a significant development as far as a long-range strategic unmanned system. The Russians are developing the Poseidon long-range underwater nuclear-armed capability. But also as far as particularly major Western navies are grappling with the double challenge, if you like, first of being able to sustain presence across significant areas of operations, but also to tackle the challenges surrounding the potential of high-end operations in an anti-access area denial situation, both in terms of being able to deliver capability from long range beyond those potential challenges, but also being able to operate within an anti-access area denial highly contested environment. And I think you see this, for example, in the way that the US Marine Corps commandant, with his very challenging planning guidance, is looking at those kinds of capabilities in terms of amphibious operations. And in terms both for the US Navy at its level, unmanned systems will be a significant part of its challenge of maintaining capability and presence, and in some way delivering on not only the headmark of whatever it turns out to be, 355 ships, or if there are going to be adjustments on that, but also for countries at a more medium level like the United Kingdom, as it grapples with some of its challenges in terms of delivering on a more global, more capable, higher readiness presence. So I think we are at an inflection point in some ways in the maritime space, that having talked about these systems and having experimented with these systems in some significant way, there is a point now, I think, where navies, particularly major Western navies, are going to have to deliver on those kinds of capabilities and mainstream those capabilities if they are going to achieve the ambitions they're talking about.
Nick, thanks very much. And I know NATO Middle East is all the rage, but we must remember that the Asia Pacific is fairly important as well. So Meia, do you want to say a few words on China and all this?
Thank you very much, John. Yes, as my colleagues already mentioned, China is pursuing autonomous systems both in air but also in the water, and we saw an indication of this in the PLA's 70th anniversary parade just last year. But I wanted to highlight two things. One is a really large effort on the part of the Chinese government under President Xi Jinping's guidance, of course, to pursue civil-military fusion programs. And really a key area of expertise that the Chinese want to push forward in and ultimately lead in is, of course, artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, both for civil as well as military uses. And the second point that I wanted to talk about very, very briefly was the discussion around societal issues, as Barrie, as Douglas called them. And in China, this discussion is still moving forward. One might assume that Chinese might be more comfortable with human out of the loop because of the nature of the system, but actually in press releases last year of certain high-level AI conferences, we see that in China the trend is still very much to be cautious about taking human out of the loop in autonomous systems, and there is still an emphasis of keeping human in the loop for the foreseeable future.
Brilliant. Many thanks. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, and I owe you down that. I'm sorry, absolutely. And you too. Yep.
Thank you. Dominic Nichols from the Daily Telegraph. PGMs, would you go so far as to say that this is possibly a moment of revolution in military affairs? Because if we're down to CEPs of less than 5 meters, it really does push that employment of military force firmly into the political arena. If you can choose between critical national infrastructure, civilian populations, military targets, it really does focus the minds of politicians, and maybe that opens more avenues for dialogue if the stakes are now very, very high, given the precision. Just be interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Brilliant. Can I just park that question for a moment, because I've suddenly seen 2 or 3 people come up, and then I'll come back to the panel. So, I owed someone back there. If you can raise your hand again. There you go. High enough so that the microphone sees it. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Paul Krüger from Süddeutsche Zeitung. I have a very specific question regarding Germany. Nuclear sharing will probably feature big in the talk with President Macron tomorrow, and it's a big issue within NATO. I had the joy to discuss it with François yesterday in private. Germany is looking at a replacement for the Tornado fighter jet, which is supposed to fulfill several roles within the Bundeswehr. They are looking at F-18, they are looking at F-35, they are looking at upgrading the Eurofighter to nuclear role, and I was wondering if you could give a neutral view, what would be the wisest way to proceed, because it seems that in the German debate, politics plays a lot into that.
I'll take one more and then I'll come back. So yes, in the second row, I think Philip Morris.
Daniel Böhmer of Die Welt newspaper. Taking the cue of what François just said about delivery systems in the Middle East, I remember last year when I was here, I asked about those steps that some regional powers in the Middle East had taken in the past that in the long run would enable them to start a nuclear weapons program of their own. And I remember that back then you said that those efforts for now had come to a halt because it seemed that the JCPOA was more or less effective. I suppose we would all agree that the JCPOA doesn't seem so safe anymore now. So I wonder, apart from those that evidence in delivery systems, do you see any other signs that those regional powers might rethink on how to prepare for a possible nuclear race?
Thank you. Okay, in this order, Doug, Barrie, François, and then Bastian. Doug.
Very briefly on the PGM question, I'd simply say that your accuracy is only as good as your targeting information. So if your targeting information isn't any good, then a 5-meter CEP is fantastic, but you've hit the wrong spot on the globe. In terms of the German procurement, I think there are two things in play here, and actually there are two procurements in play. The one is a fairly straightforward replacement of the Tranche 1 aircraft. It will probably be about 36 more Eurofighters, Typhoons, as the Brits call them. The bigger question, as you correctly point out, is around the Tornado successor. At the moment, it's my understanding that the 35 has been removed from the competition for the moment. That's been politically ruled out. That said, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see the industry and the US trying to keep that aircraft, so keep the F-35 in play in some shape or form. I think the interesting question, or an interesting question, is in terms of where the F-18EF goes. If the US Navy is going to stop procurement comparatively early in the 2020s, what does that mean about German thinking in buying into that aircraft at a specific point? Conversely, if you don't buy more Eurofighters beyond the 36 as a Tranche 1 replacement, what kind of signal does that send to your industry? How do you move in technology terms from the current generation, if you like, from Eurofighter to SCAF NGF? How do you bridge that gap? There are a number of things in play here. I know you asked what would be the best choice would be. It's not my place to answer that. I would simply say that there's a bit of me thinks that the solution won't be one aircraft, that it might be a mixed procurement, partly for political reasons, partly for operational reasons, partly for pragmatic reasons.
François.
Yeah, Leslie, I'll start with the JCPOA / nuclear question first. Well, as you all know, the Americans decided to no longer abide by the terms of the JCPOA a year and a half ago. This has, in the latest permutation, led the Iranians to essentially indicate that they too would no longer consider themselves to be bound by this or that limit within the JCPOA, limits on enrichment, limits on the quantities, limits on the speed with which enrichment takes place, and so on. But to my knowledge, and only to my knowledge, and there are things which may be going on which I do not know about, there is as yet no clear sign that Iran has actually done the things that it says it has the right to do. That we'll have to wait and see, and as you know, the Europeans have launched, the European signatories of the JCPOA have launched the procedure where one can decide whether there's been a violation or not of the JCPOA. As for a broader work in Iran, which could be of nuclear relevance if they decided to break out, I have, here again, only myself, not heard that there has been new attempts in terms of lengthening the range of their missiles, or in terms of proceeding with tests which could be those you would want to run if you wanted to put a nuclear weapon at the end of your delivery system. So for the time being, things do not appear, certainly not yet, as having reached a threshold. I don't call it a revolution in military affairs, by the way. I never bought into the RMA as a concept. Accuracy is a revolution, but it's not a revolution in military affairs. Why in Iran, by the way? That's another question. Why is this, has this developed in Iran? Possibly more than in other places. Well, for a very simple reason, is that Iran cannot acquire combat aircraft, and therefore their only practical option is to actually make their missiles do the things which you would normally expect manned aircraft to do. So they may actually have a head start in terms of the kind of operational planning and operational conduct which are required to make accuracy a valuable asset. Germany, just a quick word. It's difficult to be German, if I can put it that way. If NATO were to think anew about extending deterrence, I am pretty confident, I stand to be ruled down, but I don't think I will be. I feel pretty confident that neither the Americans nor the European members of NATO would choose a gravity bomb, even a slightly ameliorated gravity bomb, as their weapon of choice to extend deterrence. The B-61 is not normally what you would want. You have to get into the heart of the A2AD Russian bubble to deposit the bomb like an egg in a nest. So in order to get the aircraft, whether they're German or French or American, whichever the Germans choose, to get the aircraft to the place where it has to drop the bomb, it has to be accompanied by an enormous amount of support from other aircraft, manned or unmanned. And the aircraft themselves have to have special characteristics to allow it to fly in a particularly hostile environment, including in terms of radiation. The French don't have this problem, because we've got a cruise missile, supersonic cruise missile on our nuclear-tasked aircraft. So we fire from 300 or whatever it is, kilometers. We don't have to get into the heart of the A2AD bubble. But the Germans and the Italians, the Belgians and the Dutch do need to do so. And therefore, when you look at the cost benefit of whatever procurement you're going to engage in Germany in particular, you have to take into account that you're not simply buying the aircraft which carry the bomb and hopefully can get it to where it's required, but you're actually having to mobilize a very substantial share of NATO's air assets in support of those nuclear missions of NATO. On this one, I really wouldn't want to be a German taxpayer, and I wouldn't want to have to make that decision, because the only outcome of the decision is going to be suboptimal, because the requirement is to use a suboptimal weapon and get it to its destination.
Well, a British taxpayer, but a German national last. Bastian.
I was about to say, I am German, and so far I feel fine, but it's only 1:25, so it's early days. But I think, why is this conversation so difficult in Germany? I think you heard part of the answer already, but I think depending on whether you look at it from a capability logic or a defense industrial logic or a domestic political logic, the answer to the question is a different one. And that is why this is so complicated to sort out. If you're going purely from a capability now kind of question, a lot of people will want to go with something American for now. If you look at it from a defense industrial angle, the answer is different. And if you look at it from a political domestic angle, you don't want to have the debate in the first place. And that is why this is a complicated issue, and that's why it's complicated to be German on this question. But I think it is obviously unavoidable to address this now. It's probably already a bit too late, whatever the outcome actually is, whatever the choice. So we've been promised an answer by the end of the first quarter, so we will stay tuned.
Any other burning questions? Oh yes, I forgot you, and so now I haven't. So the last one from you, and then we'll have lunch.
Judy Dempsey, Carnegie Europe. This is an incredibly depressing discussion. François, I've got a direct question for you. You've described what Iran is doing and the sophistication of both proliferation and ballistic missiles. What will it take to revive arms control, which none of you mention?
In a post-JCPOA context,
Yeah,
but
in a
more broadly.
post-JCPOA and post-START context.
And INF.
The answer is there probably won't be a revival of arms control. That is, no, I mean, there wasn't arms control in the 50s. It was a terrible time. But arms control is not a historical norm. Arms control was something which was built with great difficulty and great success, I would add, from the early 60s until the last arms control treaties 10 years ago. I'm afraid that we're reverting to norm. That is a world in which you may have rules of the road in the form of the Hague or Geneva Conventions and the like, but where you're going to have the law of the jungle when it comes to systems which are developed or deployed. I'm very, very, very worried. And that's where the START thing is actually, in my view, the real clincher. If START is renewed, there is some hope. If START is not renewed, then personally, it would be a prudent force planner who would assume that there won't be arms control in the future. For the force planner, this may make life easier. For ordinary human beings and governments, it will make life a lot more difficult.
We have 45 minutes to go before Wolfgang Ischinger makes an uplifting statement to start the Munich Security Conference, but having been prudently depressed by elements of what we've said, but I hope extremely well informed by both the database and the analysis that we provided, I hope that we can send you, at least from here, with a spring in your step back into the Bayerischer Hof. Thank you very much for attending. The book is here to reward all of those who made the trip into this bank today. Thank you very much.